This week we're focusing on how the public uses social media and other platforms to voice their concerns around prices and what they think they're getting in terms of value for their money. And the the sentiment rather that we're going to be tracing is around the fast food and retail sectors. JP Kloppers, the Chief Executive of Brands Eye, joins me now for more. I am a serial complainer when it comes to prices and not always feeling I'm getting value for money. Why this particular focus first, JP?
I think what we saw a couple of weeks ago when we looked at sentiments in the market is that surprisingly in both coffee and retail and fast food and insurance actually, the factor that was causing people to complain the most about the people who had the worst sentiment was price. So we decided to dig into that a little bit more and just see what could we see in terms of how much pressure the South African consumer is under right now when it comes to price, and how's that affecting kind of brand loyalty.
And what were the findings of the tracker for this week?
I think for us the most surprising finding was in the fast food sector. We saw that Nando's and Steers were both right at the bottom in terms of sentiment. They had the worst sentiment in the market, and it was largely around people tweeting saying, look, we love your brand, we love your food, but your prices are too high.
Yeah, Nando's and Steers is quite expensive relative to their peers, so that really feels like an accurate reflection.
Yeah, but what we hadn't seen before was people voicing that on social media. So the fact that that's now emerged to the top as a topic that is actually really important, I think these brands would be wise to just think about how do they kind of position their brand and their menu accordingly. So that the South African consumer...
And the kind of conversation that will emerge out of this, and I would assume, of course, we'll show some of the Twitter conversations now, but in essence, what are consumers actually saying?
It's as straightforward as both cut your prices and looking at the value that customers are getting. So there was one tweet where somebody mentioned both Nando's and Steers in the same tweet, and it was basically just cut it, cut it, cut it, cut it.
Okay, that's really...
So it doesn't get kind of clearer than that. And the second one was around looking at, I think it was for Nando's specifically, it was just somebody looking at the size of a piece of chicken compared to their hand and saying, you can't put up the prices and decrease the size of the chicken.
There you have it. I must say the one thing that Nando's does have going for it, for those of us who are obsessed with portion control, I think that's the only time when you're okay with a piece of chicken that is smaller than your own hand. But again, you've picked up some conversations around Woolworths and Spar and other retailers. From those retailers where it's not fast food, but the retail industry in particular, what's the conversation emerging as?
There it's almost as you'd expect. I think Woolworths is perceived as the most expensive, it probably is. And so people kind of talking about it being the most expensive, that wasn't too much of a surprise. Quite a bit of negative sentiment around the Woolies price point.
Wouldn't Spar be a bit of a surprise? Because one would always think about Spar and affordability in one sentence.
Spar was, yeah. I would have expected them to kind of be on the more positive side when it comes to sentiment. But certainly from a consumer experience, that's not what they're experiencing. So there is a kind of brand mismatch, if you like, for them between what the consumer is experiencing and what they think their brand is actually standing for.
So JP, if we were to match what consumers are saying and the reality on the shelf and within the store, are customers rightfully complaining, are prices inflated in South Africa?
I don't think I wouldn't say they're inflated. I think what we've seen over the past 6 months, and the other research companies that have put out kind of what is the real growth in food price. And on the basic end of the spectrum, food prices in the last 6 months have gone up by, I think it's 19%. There's a slide on that. So I think it has gone up. What was strange in the results is there's actually a lot less conversation about price sensitivity in the retail side and a lot more on the fast food side. So I think it's almost the experience has shifted from the retail side to the fast food side in terms of where the pinch is.
Yeah. And is this because we're just eating out more and therefore just more aware of the increases in the fast food space and not so much in the retail space?
I think it's more because people expect it on the retail side.
Yeah.
And when it comes to the disposable income, where it's kind of a luxury purchase to get fast food, they're saying, hang on, we want better value for money. but they don't complain it on the basic foodstuffs because that's just what the prices are.
So the graph that was up in a second, and if we could pull that up, also shows that macro, for example, has a relatively low negative sentiment. And does this just go back to the whole buying bulk and wholesale, that it makes us feel or believe that we're getting better value for money?
Yeah, I think so. They're doing a good job right now in meeting the South African customer where they're at. So the sentiment towards macro in perception and I think in experience is very good.
And before we move to Brexit, because I know that's another key conversation that we're going to be looking at, just a quick insight around the kind of items within the retail sector that seem to be popping up as the tension points for consumers. Are we worried about the cost of milk? Is it the cost of bread? What is it in the retail space that we're thinking, oh, maybe this is not, this is less affordable this time around?
I think it's more in the comparison. So where the price of eggs, for example, there was a tweet that went up where Pick n Pay was 21 Rand less than Woolies.
Cheapest.
I think it's where people feel like they're getting a bad deal. And we see it actually across multiple food items. But I think it's more in that mismatch in expectation when somebody gets something they realize, hang on, I'm just being taken for a ride here.
I love that meme where the guy in this with the 53 retweets is almost really saying, really, is this how much I'm paying for what? I'm not sure which product he's looking at there, but I've seen this on Twitter, and it certainly, I think, reflects a lot of consumers and the way they're thinking about prices in the retail space. I want us to shift gears for a second now so that we can begin to look at the Brexit conversation. We've just had that conversation now with Chris Gilmore and Tabi Lioko. So we're going to break into our trend tracker now and bring you the Brexit sentiment from the social media space. So last week was all about the referendum. We know how that went. And here we are in a post-Brexit world. Brand's Eye, how did you guys approach this?
So we've been listening in on the conversation just to see what is actually happening in the UK since Brexit. I think having seen the sentiment before and seeing the waiting towards leave beforehand, what's the sort of after effect or
aftermath?
What are people waking up to?
Yeah.
Exactly. And surprisingly and unsurprisingly, I guess, it's mostly about the politics. I think a lot of people are trying to put the focus onto the economy and onto social issues. But actually, by and large, from what we've seen on Twitter and across social media in the UK, most of the conversation is still around the politics of it. And I think that's almost indicative of the leadership void that they've experienced. David Cameron resigning, a lot of negative sentiment towards most of the politicians.
And of course, Boris also deciding that he's not going to go in that race. So 12.5% dedicated towards politics, economics coming in at less than half. And what are the social issues that are making up the 2.1%? I
think the social issues are things like, will my passport still work? What's travel going to be like? Are the prices of goods going to go up? It's just the experience that I have. And one of the big themes that came through in the social issues is just the sort of racial tension that they're experiencing in Britain right now. And it's actually quite a big portion of the conversation is just around people saying, like local British people who obviously voted leave, saying to people of other nationalities, you need to go home now.
And that's really interesting because I think there's been a lot of tiptoeing around the underlying racial consideration in how people voted when it comes to Brexit. And it's interesting that through Twitter and other social media platforms, this is now coming to the fore and saying, actually, this is a thing we've been suppressing and we're going to now voice it.
Yeah, and it's kind of the ugly side of social media is when it gives a lot of people license to say things which they wouldn't ordinarily have said. And I think in this kind of post-Brexit racism, we've seen quite a lot of that, which I think it's ugly to read, but it's very real to kind of deal with.
Absolutely. I want to quickly go back to some of the political sentiment, and I think we had the graph up there that shows the negative sentiment around the politicians that are involved, and there you have it. And basically, what does these data points tell us?
To me, it speaks about two things. I think in the big four, Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn, and David Cameron all have quite a large portion of negative sentiment. David Cameron somewhat shielded from it in resigning kind of straight away. But the kind of one surprise there was the Scottish leader, Nicola Sturgeon, who came out actually with a lot of positive sentiment. And so while the Scottish referendum conversation is quite small in the grand scheme, 2.6 million points of conversation, 16,000 of those were about the referendum from Scotland. But I think the fact that she's kind of galvanizing people means that she's a leader to watch closely.
Absolutely, and that ties in exactly with what Chris Gilmore was also saying about keeping an eye on Scotland. JP, thank you for making the time to join us. I really feel that I go through Twitter with a different eye after conversations with JP. JP Kloppers is the Chief Executive of Brands Eye.